Well, hello there again. This is Jeff Cloud with Volume 1, Session 5 of Joe Gibbs' Game Plan for Life video series. The elaboration videos, as I call them, for teachers who will be teaching probably 4 crossroads reentry, and we'll be teaching probably anywhere from maybe 8 to 12 sessions on Joe Gibbs' Game Plan for Life. Well, let's pick right up at Roman numeral 1, of course, intro. Don't forget phone number, 704-499-1332. People can call from outside once they're out, anywhere in the United States of America, for help with any need they got, jobs, places to stay, etc., coming out of an incarceration facility. We don't do it for everybody because it would drown us out. In other words, homeless people that aren't coming from incarceration facilities, we don't do that nationwide. But we do it for people coming out of incarceration facilities nationwide with any need. Call that number, 704-499-1332. Roman numeral 2, about 3 minutes, you will play a video, and it'll talk about the shape rig for every track. And that's kind of neat because I live about a half a mile as the crow flies from Joe Gibbs Racing in the spring and fall. Might have my windows up running the whole house fan, and I can actually hear them doing that periodically. So nice sound. It's not like a bad sound, but nice sound because their engines are so tuned. But they'll say if they're doing Daytona, it's just pedal to the metal. They're doing 7,000 RPMs the entire time circling around, so all you hear is. But if they're doing a little small track, for example, Martinsville or somewhere like that, you hear. And it's kind of neat. What they're doing is using that shape rig for every track. So they're actually coming in the dynos and the shape rigs, and they can actually practice on tracks, which is so cool. Anyhow, Roman numeral 3, elaborate for about 5 minutes. You got a point there. Money will either master us or we will master money. It's kind of like there's little or no in between, and God wants us to master money. Then you can throw out, of course, the second bullet point there, or second point, which is ask this question: is money or the love of money the root of all evil? Many people think it's money, but the Bible says the love of money is the root of all evil. So, many times we hear in society, follow the money if there's something wrong or whatever the case is, and we can track down where that is. But the key is this: money is not evil in and of itself. Money is realistically a tool. And everybody gets different amounts of it. And we'll talk a little bit more about it in a subsequent Roman numeral in this video pertaining to would be stewards of God's money. So that's what you'll talk about in Roman numeral 3. Roman numeral 4, you'll play about 9 minutes of Joe Gibbs and the number 1 topic that he said was the nation's number 1 topic that men needed help with, and it was finances. Okay, so finances. In Roman numeral 5, about 18 minutes worth of teacher elaboration where you'll elaborate. And just a minute or two on each one of these, but these are what I've identified as the 9 biggies in financial arena. So I call them the 9 financial biggies. Number 1, we're to be stewards of God's money. It's all God's money, and we're just simply to be stewards of it. If He's given us a bunch, we better know what we're doing to be a good steward of His money. If we're giving very little, for example, somebody that lives in the hood, paycheck to paycheck, they're not going to be accountable for the person who made billions of dollars on an annual basis, for example, or had billions or tens of billions of dollars. So that's something to realize, is the gravity of what we're to be a steward of. Secondly, of course, you can talk about tithe, particularly for the Christian. Tithe means 1/10, and typically most people give that to their church. The third one is that the Bible has much to say about finances, and thus it needs to be read. For example, in Proverbs, it says the debtor is slave to the lender. Now, I don't know about you, but slave is a strong word, and we don't need to be slave to anything. So the Bible, for example, says that. So what should we do? Well, I'll bring up the fourth key, which is to avoid debt. I'll give you an example. Billionaires typically don't go into debt. Matter of fact, what happens with billionaires is everybody else that's going into debt with their payments on their cars, their payments on their household furniture, whatever the case may be, personal loans, that interest goes somewhere, and typically where it goes to is the rich who have invested in the companies who are giving the loans, for example. So billionaires know that you avoid debt like the plague, okay? So that fourth one was avoid debt. 5 is to have financial mentors. 5 is to have financial mentors. For example, if somebody wants to be a millionaire, let's make them 18 years old. I'd strongly suggest going and getting a bunch of good books from the library on millionaire, becoming a millionaire, or getting rich, whatever the case is, and then read those and look for common themes that go all the way across. And what you'd see, of course, is many of them have the same common themes we're talking about right here for finances. So, but you do want financial mentors. And of course, just like AA, a good sponsor who is a mentor, you want somebody who has gotten sober and stayed sober and knows a bit about those two things. So that would be a great sponsor. Well, the same way in anything we want a mentor for, they've been there and done it, been successful at it. And of course, finances would be the same way. 6, budgeting. And budgeting has, in my opinion, a lot of freedom in it. What I mean by that is some people will get a budget and start from there. Others, like me, sometimes believe it might be best just to look back and see what you've been doing, then develop your budget from that, and then modify it as need be going forward. What that means is, of course, generally everybody has records of what they spent in the past. Not everybody, I should say, but most of us do. On the outside of jails and prisons, of course, somebody coming out jail or prison, before they get out, maybe just throw in a little, notebook, a little planner, or whatever the case is, something like that right there, and they carry it around with them. And if they got a checking account, they're gonna know what all they spent through their checks. But what about when they spend $1.25, for example, on a Coca-Cola? Well, that's where they can write that down. And what starts happening is they track, for example, some of their miscellaneous expenditures. But budget is a good thing. Now, this is just a side note for people who sometimes feel like they got too many things on their plate. Now, I'm talking to the teachers now, not as much in what you're going to teach students. But in Christianity, I've had it happen, and I've seen, for example, in Mecklenburg County, Charlotte area, North Carolina, I've seen all the megachurch preachers burn out. How did they burn out? They had the big old S on their chest. It said super Christian, super megachurch preacher, whatever the case is, and they piled too much on their plate, okay? They eventually burn out. What happened when they burn out? They had to give some of that stuff out on the plate. Now, generally what happened is, it happened to me as well too, years ago. So what I've done since then, of course, is keep balance in life of about 40, 45 hours a week of work. And then, of course, the other things, sabbaticals periodically, play, sleep, all those other things we got to have time for, family, etc. Keeps balance in life, but many people never think of a time budget. And there's the same principle there for you teachers as the financial budget. So just throwing that out there. We always talk financial budget, but how many people do a time budget? Because life's not about how much can we cram into a to-do list. Life's about, and as a matter of fact, I encourage you to pray this prayer with me. I've been praying this prayer probably a decade or longer. Lord, help me to be about your kingdom business and not be busy. I'm going to say that again. Lord, help me to be about your kingdom business and not be too busy. All right. The reason for that is, particularly for us men, most of us men have a tendency to associate importance with busyness. For example, you go up to an average man, man, how you been? Man, I'm busy. What is he trying to say? I'm important. And that's not what God said. You can't show me that anywhere in the Bible that busyness equals importance. Because if it did, Jesus would have said, I'm going to the cross and I'm dying for the people who will be busy. And that ain't what he said. That ain't what he did. So anyhow, throwing that out there just as a side note. Number 7, save. And of course, the common theme of saving for regular savings is to get about a 3-month nest egg. Why 3 months? I think that originated from Proverbs, where there's a proverb that says this: look to the ant. And it talks about how they know that a winter season is coming and they store up before the winter season. Now, Jerusalem is about like Charlotte in that same climate, roughly the same, I reckon you call it latitude on the earth. And we have about 3 months of winter where you don't see the ant the same way over there. And of course, what would happen is while the ant, you're not seeing that ant is eating off of what they saved up over the winter down in the ground somewhere probably. So the point being that look to the ant, and the ant gives you that 3-month type of nest egg. So that's what we typically look for saving. Once somebody's got their saving in place on that number 7, you move to number 8, which is investing. Investing is a form of saving, but a little bit higher level. For example, stocks, bonds, gold, real estate, etc., so on and so forth. And the Bible has a lot to say about it. For example, cast your bread upon many waters. What is that saying? Diversify your investments. Don't sit there and put everything in one hot stock that somebody told you about. But find people who've been successful in investing and, get up under them. And also, let me give you a word of caution here. Be careful about going to professional investors. What do you mean by that, Cloud? For example, I hope nobody's working for Wells Fargo, but let's say that somebody works for Wells Fargo as an investment strategist, and you were to come to them with your nest egg, they're going to put you into, because their company requires it, what makes Wells Fargo the most money and what makes them thus personally the most money. So not necessarily are they looking out for your best interest. But as a side note, feel free to give me a call if you ever want any what I call basic, give me the 10-minute tidbits of how to invest money and to keep my costs down, et cetera, so on and so forth, and diversification and things like that if you want to. I'd be glad to talk with you 10 minutes or so if you need that in yourself. And then, of course, 9th is financial goals. And so not only a budget, but what are your financial goals? Paying for my kids' college in a few years. Want to retire. Now, where do you want to retire? And what lifestyle? Up here, the big lake houses, or down here in the hood you're happy with, or where in between? Need to have those financial goals because they're going to set investments and stuff like that. But those are the big 9. And that would do it, of course, for Roman numeral 5. Roman numeral 6, you'll play 10 minutes of video with Ron Blue. And then in Roman numeral 7, you as the teacher will elaborate. And the first one you see is we're looking at advertising. What goes into the mind sinks down into the heart or the inner being and comes out in how we walk or live. I'm going to say that again. What we let into our mind could be advertising, could be reading the Bible, could be looking at porno. Hopefully we're not doing that. But what we let into the mind is going to go down into the heart, the inner being, and it's going to come out in how we walk or live, guaranteed. Advertisers know that. And that's what they do. So we got to be careful with advertising and, be careful what we let into the mind because it's going to go down into the heart. It's going to come out in how we walk or live. So if people are watching advertisements all the time, the advertisements specifically are geared towards you need this and you don't have that, and to be happy you got to get that. Boom. So be careful with that. The next point, follow someone's checkbook to hear their life story, and that would be their current life story. You want to find out if somebody's a giver, you follow their two things really, checkbook and then time. What do I mean by that? Most people, it's going to be checkbooks. You and I typically are teaching for Crossroads, it's our checkbook. But if you want to hear somebody's current life story, you could also go listen to their time. For example, some people are poor. Their checkbook, they barely make it, scrapping by week to week. But if you want to hear that life story, is that person a giver? Do they believe in the Lord? The Lord's a giver. They want to be Christ-like. Are they giving their time? But for these purposes, you're going to stick primarily to, of course, follow someone's checkbook. What are they doing? Man, in the old life, I was spending money at the bar and on women. And you could go look at the rest of it. 80% of my stuff was for my house payments and my bills. We're not talking about all that kind of stuff. We're talking about that other 20% disposable spending per se. What was mine? Oh, he's spending money on beer here. He's going to the bar here. He's taking this gal out to eat. Da-da-da-da-da-da. What were my two gods? Sick women, spiritually sick women, when I was a practicing alcoholic living that old life and didn't give a rip about God. And then, of course, booze was my drug of choice. And the only reason booze was, and not a drug like cocaine or meth or crack, was simply because I was so tight. But that being said, you could have followed my checkbook and heard my life story at that point in time. Here was an interesting statement that Ron Blue, this is the third point under elaboration, he said he had rarely seen billionaires content. I'm going to say that again. He said he had rarely seen billionaires content. And I think I know a little bit why. When somebody has more money, they typically have more problems. What are the problems? How to invest the money, how to keep the money, how to keep the money from being stolen, how to find people to trust with components of their money. And that would be billionaires, for example, and to some degree, probably millionaires as well, too. It's all probably in the perspective, maybe as many as 90% of the people in America aren't saved. Okay. That's just my number. I believe it approximately. But say 90% aren't saved. Well, what goes on is, of course, they don't have a God perspective on their money, in which the first one in the points that I said a while ago, 9 points, was we are to be stewards of God's money. So if he's given us a bunch of money, that's the platform we're supposed to have, billionaires, millionaires, whatever the case may be. If we are dirt poor, living in the hood, believe it or not, that, I believe, is a platform as well, too. Now, here's why I say that. Somebody's saved, they're living in the hood. They may have poverty in the material sense, but here's what's really going on. If all the Christians got rich and wealthy and got out of the hood, who would be there to tell them the gospel? Blowing your mind there, right? But anyhow, that being said, I believe for us Christians, everything's a platform. Doesn't matter what it is. I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. One of the greatest Christians I've ever known had legs that were about that long, about 3 or 4 inches long. And she went to church with me about 23 years ago, whatever it was, and was like the matriarch of all the single women. They went to her for advice, prayer, counseling, the whole gamut there. And this lady was in a wheelchair, bound in a wheelchair, and her little legs were about 3, 4, 5 inches long. But yet, she glorified the Lord tremendously, because I have never seen anybody do as much for the Lord with so little. That glorified the Lord, because she was doing it in the Lord. It wasn't on human strength or human ability or with the normal human stuff. She supported herself work-wise. She gave to others time. I'm sure money, too. She didn't have much money, but she was a giver. And when she passed, about 15 years ago, it was amazing to see. I did not see a single wet eye at her funeral. That wasn't because people weren't going to miss her. It was because everybody was second most sure of her salvation to only their own. I'm going to say that again. Everybody was so sure of her salvation, her faith in Christ, second to only their own, that every one of us knew she had gotten out of that old broken body, and she was glorified body in a glorified body in different state, heaven, etc. So that being said, you know, Ron Blue said he'd rarely seen billionaires content. It's because probably they haven't brought their money under God's direct will and seen it as simply we're to be stewards of whatever God's given us financially. The last little point under that elaboration in Roman numeral 7 is debt is but a symptom of a deeper problem. Debt is but a symptom of a deeper problem. What is the problem? Self. Okay, guaranteed. What is the problem? Self. So debt is a deeper symptom of another problem. Greed, for example, based on self. Self has to have. I see it, I want it. All right. Boom, I go into debt. That would be self is the underlying problem. A symptom that comes out of self is or can be debt. Okay. All right. So those are the ones that you elaborate on under Roman numeral 7. In Roman numeral 8, you play a couple of minutes of Derwin Gray and the Shaker, again going back to the track on the video. And in Roman numeral 9, you elaborate. Here's what the elaboration is. For finances, there's two musts. Number one, dependency on God, even for our finances. What does he say about it? What does he say in the Bible? What does he teach me through godly counsel? That means people who've been there and been successful under God with their finances. All right? That's the way we depend on God to take control of our finances. So, two musts. One is dependency upon God, and secondly, practice the principles that have been presented here. Practice the principles that have been presented here. For example, one of the principles was avoid debt. Now, I will say this. Sometimes we need to get under the hood and define words. Now, here's what I'm defining by words is debt. Debt, to me, is anything that I was to walk away from and owe more than it's worth. So, for example, somebody puts 20% down on their house in Charlotte. Historically, we've only had houses go down once or twice about 15%. So if they've already put 20% down, the houses went down 15%. They've got plenty of equity in. They could sell their house for 85%, pay off the 80% of debt because they put 20% down. To me, that's not debt. Why? Because they wouldn't owe more than it was worth if they had to walk away from it because of sickness, etc., so on and so forth. And that leads to a reasonableness that now we can have people build houses. So be careful and define what debt is, number one, but mainly, of course, that would be a principle to avoid it. So those two things, again, were two musts: dependency on God, and then secondly, practice the principles that have been presented in this session. All right, that being done, we look forward to seeing you in Volume 1, Session 6. But before I go, as always, close. We've been blessed. Now, let's go be a blessing.